Hey there, True Crime family. Welcome to True Crime from my couch. I'm your host, Allie, and today we're diving into one of the most complex and heartbreaking unsolved cases in American history, the murder of JonBenét Ramsey. Before we begin, I need to give a content warning. This episode contains discussion of violence against a child and sexual assault. While we'll be examining the evidence and theories in detail, it's important to remember that at the heart of this case is a real little girl who lost her life in a horrific way. JonBenét was a daughter, a sister, a student, a child with her whole life ahead of her. Let's start with some context about Boulder, Colorado in 1996. Picture a wealthy, peaceful college town nestled against the Rocky Mountains. Crime rates were low, so low that the Boulder Police Department hadn't handled a homicide case in the entire year leading up to JonBenét's murder. This detail becomes important later when we look at how the investigation was handled. The Ramsey family lived in a beautiful 15-room Tudor-style house at 755 15th Street in one of Boulder's most prestigious neighborhoods. Let me paint you a picture of this family. John Ramsey was 53, a successful businessman who worked his way up from the Navy to become CEO of Access Graphics, a computer distribution company. In 1996, Access Graphics had just hit $1 billion in sales, earning John the nickname Billion Dollar Dad in the local press. He'd been married before. He had 3 older children from his first marriage, though his eldest daughter Elizabeth had tragically died in a car accident in 1992. Patsy Ramsey was 39, a former beauty queen who'd been crowned Miss West Virginia in 1977. She was a graduate of West Virginia University and had previously worked as an advertising executive. After marrying John in 1980, she became a full-time mom and was heavily involved in Boulder's social scene. She was also a cancer survivor, having beaten stage 4 ovarian cancer in 1993. Burke was their 9-year-old son, a quiet 4th grader who friends and teachers described as being interested in video games and building things. And then there was JonBenét herself, just 6 years old, in kindergarten at High Peaks Elementary School. Her full name was JonBenét Patricia Ramsey, named after her father, JonBenét Ramsey, and her mother, Patricia. She was known for being outgoing and precocious, already reading above her grade level. Now, I need to address the pageant aspect of this case because it's often sensationalized in media coverage. Yes, JonBenét participated in child beauty pageants. She'd won several titles, including Little Miss Colorado, National Tiny Miss Beauty, and Little Miss Christmas. But it's important to understand that in the mid-90s, particularly in the South where Patsy was from, child pageants were fairly common in certain social circles. While the pageant videos that later emerged on TV might seem unsettling to modern viewers, friends and family insisted JonBenét genuinely enjoyed performing. Let's walk through that final Christmas day in detail. The morning started normally. The family opened presents, including a new bicycle for JonBenét. Several neighbors reported seeing her riding that bike in the alley behind their house that afternoon. The weather was cool but clear, typical for Boulder in December. Around 5 p.m., the Ramseys headed to their friend's house, Fleet and Priscilla White. They were hosting a Christmas dinner. Fleet White was a close friend and business associate of John's. According to multiple witness statements from the party, nothing seemed unusual. The children played while the adults socialized. JonBenét was tired from the excitement of Christmas, but otherwise seemed fine. The Ramseys left the Whites' house around 9:30 p.m. Here's where the timeline gets interesting. In their initial police statements, both John and Patsy claimed that when they got home, JonBenét was so exhausted that she was carried straight to bed, still wearing the same clothes that she'd worn to the party. John said he carried a sleeping Burke to bed as well. Both parents said they went to bed themselves shortly after. This would become a crucial detail later in the investigation. At 5:52 a.m. on December 26th, Patsy Ramsey's frantic voice came through to Boulder's 911 dispatch. "We have a kidnapping," she told the operator. "There's a note left and our daughter's gone." The dispatcher would later describe Patsy as highly agitated, almost hyperventilating. What's interesting is that the call ended abruptly. Patsy hung up before the dispatcher finished giving instructions, which is unusual in these situations. Within minutes of the 911 call, Officer Rick French arrived at the Ramsey home. This is where we start to see the first of many problematic decisions in the investigation. Instead of securing the house as a potential crime scene, officers allowed friends and family members to enter. The Ramseys called several people, including their friends Fleet and Priscilla White, who came over immediately. John Ramsey's pilot, Mike Archuleta, showed up. Their minister, Father Raul Haverstock, arrived. Each person who walked through the house potentially contaminated what we now know was a crime scene. Let's talk about that ransom note, because it's one of the most unusual pieces of evidence I've ever encountered in a true crime case. The note was written on paper from a legal pad found in the Ramseys' home, using a Sharpie marker that also belonged to the family. It began with the phrase "Mr. Ramsey," and what followed was 2.5 pages of demands and threats. The note demanded $118,000 for JonBenét's safe return, a very specific amount that exactly matched John's Christmas bonus from Access Graphics. This detail immediately caught investigators' attention because it suggested the writer had inside knowledge of the family's finances. The note was filled with unusual phrases and movie-like dialogue. "Don't try to grow a brain, John. You are not the only fat cat around. Don't underestimate us." It ended with the mysterious signature SBTC. Perhaps most puzzling was the length. At 2.5 pages, it's extraordinarily long for a ransom note. Most kidnapping notes are brief and to the point. This one rambled on, almost as if the writer was enjoying the process. Even more strange, investigators would later find what appeared to be a practice version, started on that same legal pad. Throughout the morning, police officers came and went from the house. Detective Linda Arndt arrived around 8 a.m. She would later face criticism for her handling of the scene, but it's important to remember that Boulder police hadn't dealt with a kidnapping or murder case in over a year. They were operating under the assumption that this was a kidnapping, following the instructions in the ransom note, which threatened to kill JonBenét if police were contacted. The note had specified that the kidnappers would call tomorrow between 8 a.m. and 10 a.m. with delivery instructions. As that window approached, tension in the house grew. Linda Arndt would later report that the atmosphere was chaotic, with people moving freely throughout the home. The phone never rang. By early afternoon, something about the situation made Detective Arndt uneasy. Around 1 p.m., she asked John Ramsey and Fleet White to search the house, suggesting they look for anything that seemed out of place. They started in the basement. The basement of the Ramsey home was a maze-like space with several rooms. In a small, windowless room that the family called the wine cellar, John Ramsey made the discovery that would change everything. There, on the concrete floor, was JonBenét's body. She was wrapped in a white blanket with a cord around her neck attached to the broken paintbrush handle. Her wrists were loosely bound above her head, and duct tape covered her mouth. John immediately picked up his daughter's body and carried her upstairs, crying out in anguish. While this was an understandable reaction from a father, it unfortunately compromised crucial crime scene evidence. The body was placed near the Christmas tree in the living room, where Patsy collapsed next to it, screaming. The grim task of determining exactly what happened to JonBenét fell to Boulder County Coroner Dr. John Meyer. His findings tell us a devastating story about her final hours. The official cause of death was listed as asphyxia by strangulation associated with craniocerebral trauma. In other words, she died from a combination of strangulation and a severe blow to the head. Let me break this down, because the sequence of events is crucial. JonBenét had suffered a massive skull fracture that ran for 8.5 inches. Think about that on a 6-year-old's head. The force required would have been tremendous, similar to falling a great height. This blow would have rendered her unconscious almost immediately. But, and this is important, it wasn't what killed her. The coroner found deep ligature marks around her neck from the garrote. This wasn't a simple rope. It was a carefully constructed device made from a nylon cord and the broken handle of one of Patsy's paintbrushes. The end of the cord was tied to the paintbrush handle in a way that allowed it to be tightened. She had petechial hemorrhaging, tiny burst blood vessels in her eyes and face, which tells us she was alive when the strangulation happened. Here's where things get even more disturbing. The autopsy revealed that JonBenét had eaten pineapple shortly before her death. It was still undigested in her stomach. This detail would become incredibly significant because it contradicted the parents' story about her being carried straight to bed. A bowl of pineapple was found on the kitchen table, with fingerprints from both Burke and Patsy on it, though both would later say they had no memory of serving pineapple that night. The time of death was estimated between 10 p.m. on Christmas night and 6 a.m. the next morning. This is a pretty wide window, but it's the best they could determine based on factors like rigor mortis and the digestion of that pineapple. Boulder Police Department quickly found themselves in over their heads. Remember, this was a department that hadn't handled a homicide in over a year, let alone one this complex. Within days, they had called in help from more experienced agencies, but crucial early mistakes had already been made. First, they failed to properly secure the crime scene. On the morning of the 26th, at least 10 people had been allowed to walk through the house while it was supposedly a kidnapping scene. Friends and family members moved freely throughout the rooms, potentially contaminating or destroying evidence. Second, they initially treated it as a kidnapping rather than a potential homicide, meaning they weren't looking for a body or collecting evidence with murder in mind. This changed their whole approach to processing the scene. Third, they didn't separate John and Patsy Ramsey for individual questioning immediately, which is standard procedure in cases like this. The Ramseys were allowed to stay together and communicate with each other throughout that first crucial day. Let's talk about the physical evidence they did collect, because there was a lot of it. The crime scene team found a high-tech boot print near JonBenét's body. They discovered a palm print on the wine cellar door that didn't match anyone in the family. They found a heavy Maglite flashlight on the kitchen counter, wiped clean of prints. There was a used tea bag and tea-stained glass in the kitchen sink, suggesting someone had been up during the night. The basement window became a major point of interest. John Ramsey had told police that he'd broken the window himself months earlier when he got locked out of the house and just never fixed it. But here's the thing, there were undisturbed spider webs in that window frame. Spider webs that would have been broken if someone had actually climbed through recently. Some of the most intriguing evidence came from fiber analysis. The crime lab found fibers from Patsy's red and black jacket on the sticky side of the duct tape that had been on JonBenét's mouth. They also found these same fibers in the ligature marks of the garrote. Now, some argue this could be explained by innocent transfer. After all, Patsy had hugged JonBenét earlier in the day. But others point out that finding these fibers specifically in the knots and on the sticky side of the tape is harder to explain away. They also found several dark-colored fibers on JonBenét's body that didn't match anything in the house. And there were those mysterious animal hairs on her hands. Dark-colored hairs that didn't match the family's pets or any animals known to have been in the house. Now we need to talk about the DNA evidence, because this is where things get really complicated. Over the years, this evidence has been tested and retested as technology has advanced, and the results have only added to the mystery. The initial DNA testing found traces of genetic material from an unknown male in multiple locations on JonBenét's clothing, specifically her underwear and long johns. This DNA didn't match John, Burke, or any other known suspect they had tested it against. Pretty significant, right? Well, it's not quite that simple. See, we're talking about extremely small amounts of DNA, and we can't be certain how it got there. It could have been from saliva, sweat, or skin cells. It could have been from someone who actually touched her clothing, or it could have been transferred during manufacturing or packaging. This is something a lot of people don't realize. Touch DNA is incredibly sensitive. You can find someone's DNA on an item they never actually touched, just through secondary transfer. What makes this even more complicated is that they found DNA mixtures in several areas, meaning DNA from more than one person. Most of the touch DNA analysis was inconclusive because so many people had been through the crime scene. In 2008, District Attorney Mary Lacy made a controversial decision. Based on the DNA evidence, she issued a formal letter exonerating the entire Ramsey family. She wrote that the DNA pointed to an unexplained third party, but many experts criticized this decision, saying she'd oversimplified complex DNA evidence to reach that conclusion. We need to dig deeper into this ransom note because it's one of the most unusual pieces of evidence I've ever seen in a true crime case. Let me share some of the actual language with you. The note began, "Mr. Ramsey, listen carefully. We are a group of individuals that represent a small foreign faction. We respect your business, but not the country that it serves." The note goes on to demand the sum of $118,000 for JonBenét's safe return. The writer warns that if the money isn't delivered properly, your daughter will die. They claim to be watching the house. You can try to deceive us, but be warned, we are familiar with law enforcement countermeasures. Then, there are these almost theatrical phrases like, "Don't try to grow a brain, John," and "Don't underestimate us." Handwriting experts from around the country analyzed this note. While they couldn't definitively match it to Patsy Ramsey, they also couldn't eliminate her as the writer. What's particularly interesting is that whoever wrote it seemed comfortable in the house. They knew where to find a pad of paper and a Sharpie. They took the time to write a practice note. They knew about John's bonus amount. In the days following the murder, the Boulder Police Department began to face intense criticism for their handling of the case. They'd made several crucial mistakes in those first hours, mistakes that would haunt the investigation for years to come. Think about this. In most child murder cases, investigators separate the parents immediately and interview them individually, but the Ramseys weren't formally interviewed until 4 months after JonBenét's death. By then, they'd hired lawyers and a public relations firm. They appeared on CNN just days after the murder, which many found unusual for grieving parents. In 1998, then District Attorney Alex Hunter convened a grand jury to review all the evidence of the case. This wasn't just a quick process. The grand jury met for 13 months, hearing testimony from dozens of witnesses and examining hundreds of pieces of evidence. What happened next would remain a secret for years. In 1999, the grand jury voted to indict both John and Patsy Ramsey, but not for murder. They were to be charged with child abuse resulting in death and accessory to first-degree murder. Here's the fascinating part. DA Hunter refused to sign the indictments, saying there wasn't enough evidence to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. This decision wouldn't become public knowledge until 2013, when a judge finally ordered the release of portions of the indictment. The actual language from these indictments is pretty striking. The grand jury wrote that both John and Patsy did permit a child to be unreasonably placed in a situation which posed a threat of injury to the child's life or health, which resulted in the death of JonBenét Ramsey. They also believed each parent did render assistance to a person with intent to hinder, delay, and prevent the discovery, detention, apprehension, prosecution, conviction, and punishment of such person for the commission of a crime, knowing the person being assisted has committed and was suspected of the crime of murder in the first degree and child abuse resulting in death. As the case moved into the 2000s, new technological advances began to change how investigators approach the evidence. The Boulder Police Department created a cold case unit specifically to handle unsolved murders like JonBenét's. They began using new forms of DNA testing and forensic techniques that hadn't existed in 1996. In 2006, the case took another dramatic turn when John Mark Carr, a 41-year-old teacher living in Thailand, confessed to killing JonBenét. He provided details about the crime that seemed convincing at first, and he was extradited back to Colorado. But here's the thing. His DNA didn't match the evidence from the crime scene, and investigators discovered he couldn't have been in Boulder at the time of the murder. His confession was false. That same year, Patsy Ramsey lost her battle with ovarian cancer. She died maintaining her innocence, never knowing what really happened to her daughter. John Ramsey would later remarry, but he's continued to speak out about the case, pushing for new investigations and testing of evidence. Let me bring you up to speed on where things stand today. The Boulder Police Department maintains an active investigation into JonBenét's murder. They've investigated over 21,000 tips, letters, and emails about the case. The case file now contains more than 60,000 pages of documents. They're using new DNA testing methods that weren't available in the 90s. They're re-examining evidence with new technology, looking at things that were too small or degraded to test before. But here's what makes this case so fascinating and frustrating. Every piece of evidence seems to point in multiple directions. That unidentified male DNA might suggest an intruder, but then you have to explain the ransom note written with materials from inside the house. The fiber evidence could implicate family members, but then there's that palm print that doesn't match anyone known to have been in the house. After decades of investigation, 3 main theories have emerged about what happened that night. Let's examine each one carefully. The first major theory is that an outsider broke into the house and committed this crime. Those who support this theory point to several pieces of evidence. First, there's that unidentified male DNA found on JonBenét's clothing. They argue this is proof that someone outside the family was involved. There's also that mysterious high-tech boot print found near her body, and the unidentified palm print on the wine cellar door. Some have suggested that since John Ramsey's company, Access Graphics, had just publicly announced hitting $1 billion in sales, this could have made the family a target. But there are significant problems with the intruder theory. First, how did this person know so much about the family? The ransom note specifically asked for the exact amount of John's bonus. They knew their way around the house well enough to find writing materials and spend time composing a lengthy note. They knew where to find JonBenét's bedroom, and perhaps most puzzling, why would an intruder spend so much time in the house writing a ransom note for a kidnapping that they never intended to carry out? The house showed no clear signs of forced entry. While there was that broken basement window, remember those undisturbed spider webs? Also, the family's dog never barked that night, which you might expect if a stranger entered the house. The second major theory suggests that someone in the family was involved. Supporters of this theory point to the fiber evidence matching Patsy's jacket, found in suspicious locations like the garrote knots and the sticky side of the duct tape. They note how the ransom note was written with materials from inside the house, and how its writing style shared similarities with Patsy's handwriting, though experts could never definitively match it. They also point to behavioral elements, the unusual CNN appearance, the delayed formal police interviews, the contradictions about the pineapple. Some investigators found it odd that the parents didn't immediately search the house when they found the ransom note, as many parents would. However, there are significant problems with this theory too. There was no history of abuse in the family. The Ramseys fully cooperated with DNA testing and handwriting analysis, and that unidentified male DNA remains unexplained. Plus, many who knew the family simply could not believe that they were capable of such an act, particularly against their own daughter. The third major theory suggests that Burke, who was 9 at the time, was somehow involved, and that the parents covered it up to protect him. This theory gained traction partly because of the pineapple evidence, his fingerprints were on the bowl, and some behaviors people found unusual, like him staying in his room during the initial chaos of the morning. But I want to be very clear about something. The Boulder Police Department has stated repeatedly that Burke was never a suspect. He was formally cleared by DNA evidence. At 9 years old, many experts doubt he would have had the physical capability to commit this crime or the sophistication to stage such an elaborate cover-up. He maintained his innocence throughout his life and has even successfully sued media outlets for suggesting his involvement. In the past few years, we've seen some interesting developments in this case. The Boulder Police Department announced in 2021 that they're working with genetic genealogy experts to analyze that unknown male DNA profile. They're using the same techniques that have solved other cold cases around the country. They've also partnered with private labs to use new testing methods on small or degraded pieces of evidence that couldn't be tested before. The case remains active, with investigators still following up on new tips and leads. As we wrap up this examination of the case, I think it's crucial to remember the real little girl at the center of it all. JonBenét Patricia Ramsey was born on August 6, 1990 in Atlanta, Georgia. She was named after her father, JonBenét Ramsey, and her mother, Patricia. By all accounts, she was a bright, energetic child who loved performing and brought joy to those around her. Her kindergarten teacher described her as an advanced reader who would help other students with their work. She enjoyed singing in their church choir. She was excited about learning to play the violin. She had a special bond with her older brother Burke, despite their age difference. She was, in so many ways, a normal 6-year-old little girl who should have had her whole life ahead of her. This case changed how America viewed child safety. It sparked discussions about everything from police procedure in child murders to media coverage of crimes involving children. It exposed weaknesses in how small police departments handle major cases, and it remains one of the most studied and debated criminal cases in American history. If you have any information about the murder of JonBenét Ramsey, no matter how small or insignificant it might seem, please contact the Boulder Police Department tip line at 303-441-1974. Sometimes the smallest detail can help solve a case. I'm Allie, and thank you for staying with me through this detailed examination of JonBenét Ramsey. Remember to hold your loved ones close, and I'll see you next time on True Crime from My Couch. If you haven't already, please make sure to hit the subscribe button and leave me a comment. Let me know what your theory is on this case. It's one that I have covered for as long as I can remember, and I genuinely go back and forth a lot on this one. If you want my opinion, I tend to lean towards an intruder. But I would love to hear what you have to think about it and would love to talk to you about it in the comments. So I will talk to you guys next week. Thank you. Bye.